The first time the rancher heard the warning, it didn't come as a shout or a threat but as a low, shaking whisper carried by the wind itself, the kind that slips into your ear when you're alone and makes you wonder whether it was ever spoken at all, and the words were simple, sharp, and wrong in a way that made his spine stiffen. "Don't look down there, that's off limits," and he laughed at it then, because laughter was easier than admitting fear, because men like him survived by pretending. Nothing could shake them, not the empty plains, not the long nights, not the silence that pressed so hard it felt alive, and certainly not a warning from a woman standing barefoot at the edge of his land with dust on her dress and terror in her eyes. Yet even as he laughed, his gaze drifted downward, not because he wanted to but because something older than curiosity pulled at him, something that whispered that rules existed only because something waited beneath them, something people were afraid to name. And the woman saw his eyes move and stepped forward fast, her voice cracking now as she grabbed his sleeve and hissed again that same sentence, sharper this time, edged with desperation. "Don't look down there, it's off limits," as if the ground itself might hear and react, as if the earth might open in offensive acknowledged, and the rancher shook her off, annoyed now, pride stung, because no one told him where he could or couldn't look on his own land, not some stranger who appeared at dawn like a bad omen, and he told her so, his voice hard, dismissive, the kind of tone men used when they were afraid but refused to admit it, and she stared at him then with a look that wasn't anger but grief, the kind of grief usually reserved for funerals, and she said quietly that it wasn't his land, not really, not anymore, because some places stopped belonging to men once they were broken badly enough, and he almost told her to leave, almost turned his back, but that pull returned, stronger now, a dragging weight behind his eyes, and before he could stop himself his gaze dipped past her boots, past the dry grass, to a darker strip of earth where the soil seemed pressed down, compacted, wrong, as if the ground had been handled too many times, and the moment his eyes settled there the air changed, thickened, the sounds of the plains fading as though swallowed, and the woman screamed, not loud but sharp, like something tearing, and she ran, leaving him alone with the silence in the spot he had been told not to see, and the rancher stood there longer than he meant to, hard hammering, telling himself it was nothing, just dirt, just shadows, but the longer he stared the more details crept into view, lines that didn't belong to nature, angles that suggested purpose, and a smell rose up, faint at first, then undeniable, iron and rot and something older, something that made his stomach twist, and that should have been enough to send him away, but instead he stepped closer, because fear had shifted into something worse, something like responsibility, the awful certainty that once you knew something was wrong, turning away didn't make it right again, and his boot sank slightly as he reached the edge of the darkened ground, the soil softer here, disturbed, and he crouched despite himself, despite the warning still echoing in his head, and he brushed aside loose dirt with the back of his hand, expecting maybe bones, maybe the remains of an animal. Something he could name and bury and forget, but what he uncovered wasn't a body at all, not whole, not broken, but a mark, a symbol carved deep into the earth itself, its lines burned rather than cut, blackened as if by heat, and the sight of it made his vision blur, his head throb, because he had seen it before, years ago, carved into a tree near the river after a night when the cattle screamed and 3 men vanished without tracks, and he remembered how the sheriff had ordered it covered up. How everyone agreed not to speak of it again, how the land around that tree never grew right afterward, and now here it was again, larger, fresher, pulsing faintly as though alive, and the rancher felt a sudden, overwhelming certainty that this mark was why the woman had warned him, why her voice had shaken, why no one came near this stretch of land anymore, and as he stared, frozen, something shifted beneath the symbol, a subtle movement like a breath taken by the earth itself, and panic finally cut through his stubbornness, sharp and clean, and he scrambled backward, falling onto his hands, heart racing, telling himself it was imagination, nerves, heat, but the movement came again, stronger, and the soil cracked with a soft, wet sound, and the rancher realized with horror that the ground here wasn't just marked, it was sealed, like a lid, and whatever lay beneath it was pressing upward, responding to his attention, and in that moment he understood the true meaning of off limits, that it wasn't a rule meant to protect something sacred but a boundary meant to keep something contained, and the most horrifying part was that it hadn't moved until he looked, until he acknowledged it, as if sight itself were an invitation, and the rancher staggered to his feet and ran back toward the house, lungs burning, refusing to look back, refusing to think, slamming the door behind him and bolting it though he didn't know what good wood and iron would do against something that lived in the ground, and he told himself again and again that he would leave at first light, sell the land, disappear, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true, because the mark was on his land now, because he had seen it, because whatever was beneath it had felt him there, and as the sun climbed higher the sounds returned, birds, wind, life pretending nothing was wrong, and that normalcy was worse than silence, because it meant the horror could hide, could wait, and by nightfall the rancher sat alone at his table, rifle across His knees, staring at the floorboards as though he could see through them, listening to the faintest tremors in the earth below, and when a soft knock came at his door long after dark, he knew without opening it that it wasn't the woman returning, wasn't a neighbor, wasn't anything that belonged above the ground at all. And if this story has already pulled you in, if your heart is pounding like his was in that moment, remember to subscribe to the channel now, because what the rancher does next, what he chooses to unleash in his fear, turns this warning into something far more horrifying than a glance ever was, and the story is only just beginning. The knock came again, slower this time, patient, as if whatever waited on the other side of the door knew it had all the time in the world, and the rancher sat frozen, rifle tight in his grip, sweat crawling down his spine despite the cold creeping into the room, telling himself that if he stayed silent it might go away, that things without faces or names followed rules he could outlast. But the knock returned a third time, closer somehow, heavier, and then a voice slid through the cracks of the door, low and familiar enough to twist his gut, calling his name the way his father once had when he was a boy lost in the dark. And that was when the fear truly broke him, because whatever stood outside hadn't just come from the ground, it had learned him, and the boards beneath his boots shuddered as something moved below the house. Circling, testing, and the symbol he'd uncovered burned in his mind, the memory of its lines pulsing like a wound that refused to close, and in his terror the rancher did what frightened men had always done on that land, what the stories never forgave them for. He chose action over understanding, violence over patience, and he rose, shouting for the thing to leave, his voice cracking as he yanked the door open and fired into the night, the blast tearing the darkness apart, echoing across the plains, and for a brief, awful second there was nothing there at all, no figure, no body, only empty air and the smell of gunpowder, and then the ground directly in front of him split open with a sound like tearing flesh, earth collapsing inward as something enormous shifted beneath it, and the rancher stumbled back as the soil fell away, revealing not a creature but a pit, deep and smooth, its walls carved with the same blackened symbols repeating over and over, spiraling downward, and from that pit came voices, not one but many, layered, whispering his name, thanking him, telling him the door was open now, and he realized in horror that the rifle shot hadn't driven anything away, it had finished something, like a final strike against a lock already weakened by his gaze, and the land responded, the house groaning as its foundations sank, the tremors growing stronger, relentless, and the rancher fell to his knees, screaming for it to stop, clawing at the dirt as if he could push it back into place, but the pit only widened, swallowing his porch, dragging the earth down with a hunger that felt deliberate, and as the voices rose, filled with relief and joy, he understood the true weight of what he had done, that the warning hadn't been about curiosity at all but about restraint, about leaving sealed things sealed, and when the woman appeared again at the edge of the lantern light, her face streaked with tears, she didn't shout or run this time, she only watched as the land reclaimed its debt, whispering that some horrors don't chase you, they wait for you to invite them in, and if you want to know how the rancher pays for this choice, how far the land's hunger truly reaches, make sure you're subscribed, because what follows is darker than the pit he opened, and there is no turning back from here.